Hey guys, welcome back to the lab. Today at the bench, we will be assessing the integrity of the finished spine relining from the last episode. We'll be trimming the original glued-on endbands and discussing why they need to be trimmed. We'll be constructing the hollow tube attachment for this book, and we'll also be cutting and lifting the original leather turn-ins on the boards. All right, guys, so I'm pulling this out of the press because in the last episode, I relined this text block and did a lot of text block repairs and some tipping versus a resewing, which is taking loose sections that are still loose after the first spine lining was applied and making sure they're consolidated where they're supposed to live into this text block with paste. And right now I'm just checking these trouble spots that existed and making sure that everything operates smoothly and as it should. And as you can see, it looks, I think, really good. And I'm kind of wiggling on pages that I know were loose and sections that I know had a little give to them after that first spine lining was put on. And I'm just making sure everything is living how it should be. So these are the glue-on endbands that I cleaned in the, I think, first or second episode on this book. And I've reapplied them, and I used that ace bandage to make sure they were held in place. So they're really, really well adhered. But the problem is they were a few millimeters, like a couple, too big for this volume when it was originally made. And that actually may be part of the reason why the joint leather broke, because the glue, the animal hide original glue that was on these endbands was super thick. And once it hardened, it would not have allowed the joint to flex at the head and tail of this book. And so I'm trying to just pry it loose where I have glued it to the new linen, and it's not really a big deal. I just am going to re-moisten it with some water, let it sit for a few seconds, and then pry it up. It just takes some wiggling. You can see how strong that PVA adhesive, or how tight it is, but still flexible, which is exactly what this book needs. So as you can see, that extra material is loose, and I am just going to trim it flush up against like the peak of that shoulder of the book. And I'm careful not to cut my new linen lining, but I like to get as close as possible. So I cut the thin part of the fabric in band, and now I am actually going to cut into the original. Again, I wouldn't do this unless I really had a good reason, and I do, because if I leave this material, it will inhibit how this book opens and closes, and it will cause all kinds of weird tensions that aren't supposed to be there, and I'm afraid that it will make my repair fail even faster and possibly cause more damage to this book in the coming decades. So now I'm just taking a little bit of adhesive, and I'm making sure, because this endband was like made on a machine, it's just woven, but it has a board core, and so I am making sure that that woven endband exterior isn't going to fray. So I put just a tiny bit of adhesive. And even though I didn't trim the endband on the tail of the book on this side, I am still going to apply a little adhesive. It looked like it was interested in fraying, so I figured I would stop that before it starts. And now on the other side, I need to trim, I think, both of these. So I'll go ahead and work on that. So again, that PVA adhesive holding these endbands down is holding them tightly, like firmly, but it's also flexible, which is what this book needs to continue functioning. It needs that flexibility in the joint. All right, so you see me looking at my fingertip there, and that is, I'll show you in a minute. The red from the Endband dye has bled, and that's why in the episode where I clean these Endbands, yeah, there you can see, the white stuff is PVA and the red stuff is dye, and there's little bits of cardboard stuck on my finger too. But in the episode where I clean these Endbands, I did not want the water that I used to rehydrate that animal hide glue to run up into those colors because I was afraid they would bleed. And this is a case of I don't have to be right, but I really, really don't want to be wrong because that's not something that's very fixable. Once dye bleeds, it's kind of hard to make that right. So I tend to err on the side of caution. And I don't have a proper full-size board shear because I'm only in about 400 square feet in this lab space. So I have a cut trimmer, and that's the cutter I'm using. And it does pretty much everything I need it to do. And this is the strong, kind of thicker piece of long fiber paper that I will use to construct the hollow tube. So right now I'm just measuring and cutting and fitting it how I want it on the spine of this text block. And so I'm applying PVA to the back of the paper lining on this text block. So at the end of the day, the linings on this book will be a thin, like Tengujo, held on with paste as the base layer, and then a linen lining with Endbands above it, and then a paper, it's like an 80-pound cover weight. And then this hollow tube, which is like a heavy long fiber paper. And given the size of this book, that's certainly not too many layers. You saw how the book opened earlier, and your spine linings can often determine how your book opens and closes, like if you have really stiff or like too many linings, sometimes the book won't open enough. And actually, sometimes that's what you want if there's a reason you don't want the book to open super far. And those problems can include sewing issues or brittle paper. But I think this book will open really nicely when it's all said and done, like when this final lining is on. So I've got the center adhered down, and now I'm going to crease and fold the sides to make the hollow tube structure. So I actually let that center part dry completely, and then I come back and I will paste out one side, and I don't paste out both, even though the paper will expand. Like the adhesive on the first side, that water will cause the second side to expand. I think it usually works out just fine. As you can see, I tried to be slick and put my released plastic up under my pasting out paper, and that didn't work out, but it's fine in the end. So I make sure those are well adhered together, and then I'm checking on the shoulders to make sure nothing has popped loose. And there were just a couple spots that needed a tiny bit of adhesive. So that is what I'm doing here. So now I'm just going to really quickly fold my turn-ins for the replacement spine piece on this book. So what I like to do ahead of time, this is the toned long fiber tissue that's toned to match the covers. It's pretty close. It looks even closer in daylight. So I use the board height as a guide for folding the spine piece, because ultimately it needs to match the boards on either side because it's bridging that gap. And so you'll notice I am taking my time to make sure these fit, and I just need to put a tiny little bit of PVA in the middle to make sure that the turn-in is held down, but I don't need the whole thing adhered because I actually have to cut part of it to fit it around the boards on either side. And I'm showing you this part and how carefully I fit this and everything, because I think in the next episode, I actually have to lift those two, pull them apart, and redo them. So once I get it all fitted, it doesn't quite fit and I don't like it, so I redo it, but it is what it is. So now I'm marking the depth of where how far this leather has been lifted on these boards, so that I know the depth that the turn-in cuts need to be to match the depth on the front of the board. And so I'm just rocking my knife against the board edge to make that cut, to make sure it's through the leather. And then I have my micro spatula, and I just slide it between the leather and the board and wiggle until this pops loose. And lifting these gives me space in the turn-ins to add that new material that you saw in the last scene. That tone spine replacement will ultimately go up underneath all of this leather and then around the board edge to the inside where the turn-ins are. And I apologize for my framing on this turn-in. I reworked my camera setup in the lab, so it should be better from here on, at least with the next book. And on this book, where the boards slope towards the edge on the front, they have a slope to them. They are very well adhered at those points and at the board edge also. And so I really have to take my time. I don't want to bust through this leather. If I do, I can put it back, like the piece, I can glue it back on, but I prefer to leave these whole if I can. And then for the next turn-in, I'm just going to get my dividers and get the width that I cut for the first one and reuse it on the other side. So I just make a little mark with the tip of the dividers and then cut at that mark. And again, I'll just put my knife blade at the very edge of this board and rock it back and forth to make that cut. So I avoid kind of blowing out the leather. There's always a potential to rip off the top layer, that finished layer of leather. And that shows, and I just like to avoid that. And sometimes rocking the knife can help to not cause that damage. And again, these are very well adhered, like I said, at the board edges, and this just takes a lot of patience and wiggling and kind of maneuvering of that micro spatula. So I've got my second board, my cover, and again, I'm going to pull a depth measurement with the micro spatula and then use the dividers to place that depth to make sure it's the same where I decide where those turn-in cuts need to be. And as you can see, I need to trim off a little more leather at this board edge. All right, guys. Well, thanks for tuning in this week. And in the next episode, we will reattach the boards to this book and apply the new spine covering material. So this volume should be back in book form at the end of that episode. And I hope you enjoyed this week. Be sure to ask any questions you have below, and don't forget to subscribe to show the lab some love. Thanks.